Hello, everyone. Welcome to the King Prayer Podcast. Today, I'm joined by LBK.
Hi there, Steph.
Okay,
How
yeah,
are you?
nice to have you. I'm doing all right. And today, we're going to be talking mainly about some of the recent developments in the women's game, mainly the Fairbreak T20 tournament and the women's senior T20 trophy. So, I think we should start with the women's T20 trophy. That's what you've been following a lot closer, LBK. So,
Yes.
yeah, take it away. What's been going on there?
So basically speaking, it is a tournament between the state sides of Indian women's cricket, and it is mainly divided into 6 groups. Those contain 6 teams each, and an elite group. So what happened with it is basically every group topper gets to directly go to the quarterfinals, while the second ranked team goes to the pre-quarterfinals along with the uh, played group team. So the thing is, the whole tournament kind of is a mini IPL of sorts. I mean, there's probably more games, but not as much hype to it or as much promotion to it. But one thing about the tournament is that it features a lot of talent from the international internationals and even the new emerging players. There's Yastika Bhatia from internationals. There's Shafali Verma. There's Priya Punia. There's Jamima Rodriguez. And when you look at the domestic side, there's Meghna, Hemlata, and Kiran Navgire, and many more. So it is kind of one of those tournaments that shows you what India has got in terms of the talent present in both batting, bowling, and even the fielding.
Yeah, that's yeah. It seems like an interesting tournament. It's the format seems a lot like the men's Syed Mushtaq Trophy, and yeah, sort of seems to have gone the same way. It didn't quite have a who was it? Vidarbha, I think, ended up in the plate group in the Syed Mushtaq Trophy and destroyed
Yeah.
that. So it didn't.
Yes.
Nagaland seemed to do quite well, but it wasn't quite that
Yeah.
dominant.
I mean, uh, Vidarbha from the men's side is more of a proper team. Uh, and here was pretty much being operated by one player here. So the levels of performances were different, but dominance was quite the same. So, I mean, they both won almost all the games from their group.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed with the hosts here, because each group was hosted in a different city, none of the hosts were the home team. Like the home team was always playing in a different group, which I thought was sort of interesting. Like I get that, they don't want one team to have a home advantage, but I also feel that you're not really encouraging people to come and watch if they don't have a home team to support. If their home team's in a different group entirely, never going to play a home match. So I wonder, what was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I guess that was one point. Maybe they didn't want someone to have the home advantage. Obviously, since all the games would have been played on the same. I mean, all the group games would have been played on the same pitch, so there would be kind of a highly biased advantage there. So maybe they wanted to cut that out. But I guess other than that, it is still a fact that most of the teams in women's setup still do not have an exact home ground in that prospect, because the games most often happen on the neutral venues. So yeah, you can say that they are not exactly the home grounds right now. Maybe they first need to establish the home grounds for that to be an advantage for the teams, because right now the games are mostly happening in cities like Vijayawada, which is I think in Karnataka. There's sometimes games in Cuttack. There's sometimes games in Surat. So there's still any kind of advantage waiting to be established rather than trying to overcome the advantage for any home team right now.
Another thing I noticed with some of the teams, the the balance of power seems to be a little different compared with the men's game. Because you have teams like Karnataka, Saurashtra, and Gujarat, Vidarbha, Hyderabad. They're a lot better in the men's game, but in the women's game, they're pretty much straight at the bottom. Even like a team like Meghalaya, I'm pretty sure they're a plate group team in the men's game and have never really gone out of that, but they're in an elite group here. It's quite interesting. Then you have teams like Odisha, Haryana, even Himachal
Yeah,
Pradesh. They're not very good in the men's game.
yeah.
Reach the knockouts here.
Actually, it is a good point that you bring up that the power dynamic in the women's domestic setup is pretty different. I mean, we talk about the Mumbai lobby or even the Delhi advantage in the men's game, but it is not really there in the women's setup. I mean, if you'd look at the Mumbai team, you'd see there's only Jamima Rodriguez who's played internationals, and even Delhi team is mostly reliant on their top order. So there is kind of a different setup altogether here. Obviously, railways is railways in both scenarios, but there are teams that are differently stacked here, as you said. Teams that are rather lower in the men's game are higher here, and there are teams that are higher in the men's game are lower here somewhere. You can say probably say the same about Karnataka, as you know. There's been a lot of talent in the men's side that has come from Karnataka, but here they basically rank the lowest in their group. So there's obviously a lot of difference when compared with the men's game and the levels that these states are at.
So the standout player from this tournament is probably Kiran Navgire, but 525 runs, average of 131. I think she hit the only century of the tournament as well. But the caveat is it came in the plate group with Nagaland, not in one of the elite groups. But yeah, even when she played an elite group team in the pre-quarterfinal, she did quite well. It will be interesting to see if she switches teams next time. I don't think. I don't think this. I don't think even though it's 500 runs at an average of over 100, I don't think that'll be enough to get her into the Indian side right now because it did come in the plate group. But yeah, next time around, if she can move to an elite group team, I think that would be very interesting to see how she gets on there.
Yeah, her performance kind of has railway written all over it, due to the dominance of her batting. I mean, even when the team was scoring like 110 or 120, she was the one who was scoring at a much quicker pace. And as we saw them in the first game where they scored 233 for two, she scored 162 of them. So obviously I think that is something you can see that. I mean, there's obviously other people in the group as well, right? There's other teams, there's other batters, but if you're doing that well, there's got to be something better about you. You have to be better than everyone else playing in the group, and I guess that makes her a deserving candidate to be playing for a better team. There are players who are playing for the the teams that they are not. I mean, the states that they were not born in, like uh, Radha Yadav, who is actually from Mumbai, plays for Baroda. So there are people who play for different setups, like Nuzat Praveen is from MP, but she plays for Railway. So maybe she can migrate to a better team where her talents would be better used.
Yeah, that'll definitely be a next step for her. And so I'm not actually sure how the teams get assigned in Indian domestic cricket. So I would assume that like she's under contract with Nagaland. I do wonder how easy it would be for her to switch teams next time around.
I think it's the state boards that offer them these things, and maybe they can negotiate the migration or transfer. I think that is how it works, because obviously, if Radha Yadav actually captains the Baroda team, and as I told, she is born in Mumbai and played a lot of cricket in Mumbai. So I'd assume there was, it was specifically done to bring her to the Baroda setup so that she could captain the side. So I'd assume that there is some negotiations around it.
All right then. Yes, just any final concluding remarks about the tournament?
I'd say the tournament in general had its moments, and obviously the tournament did really well to show us what is the existing talent in Indian women's setup. But I think few of the highlights of the tournament would be its knockouts, mostly because I keep talking about how you do not need competitive pitches in the T20 games, especially the domestic ones, because you don't really want those 110, run games where the batters will go into complete conservative modes, and you rather want them to be playing freely, because you know those are not the kind of games that they might end up being a part of when if they get into the international setup. And that has been one issue with India from a long time, that there's a lot of batters, apologies, who bat defensively. So I think that is one big outcome out of that, that the knockouts were relatively high scoring. Obviously, it is tough to beat Railways, and I guess no one even came close to beating them as far as their team goes. And obviously, one other thing is that India is still kind of lacking in bowling department, especially how the youngsters goes. There was good bowling performances from Maharashtra and Odisha, but out of them, there were not really any young pacers who came to the fore in the tournament. So that is kind of a worrying sight for India. But out of that, I guess there was a lot of entertaining stuff that went down in the tournament. I mean, obviously, as you said, Kiran Navgire scored a lot of runs. There was Priya Punia apologies, that was Harleen Deol who scored 100 in a chase. That was pretty good. And even Baroda chased down 170 odd in the knockout game to get to the semi-finals. So I guess we got a lot more out of the tournament, even if obviously we can say that BCCI did not push the tournament really well, which is completely their fault, in my opinion. But outside of that, the tournament is a pretty good success.
Yeah, and as with everything Indian women's cricket, we do have to bring it back to the women's IPL, and if this is if that's ever going to happen. But yeah, like this isn't the women's IPL. This is more the women's Syed Mushtaq Trophy, and the women's IPL would sort of be the next step to consolidate the best players from this into one place and play each other. Uh, yeah, like there have been positive signs recently that the women's IPL is coming along, and you just sort of hope that you know all the Amin and Ayin about it finally results in something.
Yeah, I mean, people sometimes forget, how BCCI operates. I mean, uh, any board or any cricketing body basically works for money. I think that is one thing you have to be accepting of. So, if BCCI is seeing money in that, then there will obviously be a tournament, I guess, because this is obviously not 2010s or 2000s where a women's game is unrecognized or people do not know players. I think this is the time where women cricketers are really well known. People know of their performances, people know of their achievements, and even outside of our own team, I think people know players from every team. I mean, there's Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, even Pakistan. I guess there would still be. that part where Pakistan do not play if women's IPL happens, which is kind of still sad. But outside of them, there are teams and players that general crowd has started to understand and know of. So I think everyone, including BCCI, knows that there's a lot of scope in this tournament, especially given how well the Women's Cricket World Cup was received this year. So I'm guessing, obviously, this will be coming out next year as is expected, and I think it would be a great success if executed properly.
All right, so moving on then, the other big women's thing that happened recently was the Fairbreak International Invitational, Fairbreak Invitational 2022, and yeah, was a very interesting tournament. It's very unique in what it was aiming to do. So yeah, if you can give a bit of a rundown of that.
Yeah, so basically, what I was saying is, this is one of those tournaments where you do not look at the results or even the, performances or how it has done on the basis of, let's say, engagement, because this tournament is aspiring to do something different, and it is mainly being organized to get the players from lower ranked teams and relatively unknown teams to the forefront. And honestly, it cannot be done in just one tournament. It would require many more editions of this to for it to completely come into the light with people. One thing I saw was how, if you check the most runs scored or most number of wickets taken, mostly the people who are topping those tables are from the relatively much more known teams. I mean, the highest run scorer from the relatively lesser known teams was Chantham, and she scored what 163, when the highest was 313 by Chamaria Tapattu. So obviously, that is kind of not the point of this tournament. The tournament is simply being organized to get these players the exposure and the chance to play with these elite or A-tier teams and their players, and that is what's important here. It is basically doing what ICC should have been doing. So I guess it is a really good effort, whoever has made this effort, and I think if this continues for even for a few editions, then we'll see kind of a huge change in the women's game, as we are witnessing right now with the arrival of all these T20 franchisees.
Yes, like one. So as you were saying, the top players were still mainly players from the more established nations. But I think an important thing to note is that, like, if you were to pick the 108 best players in the world, which is sort of what they've tried to do here, like they haven't included any Indian players because the T20 challenge was going on at the same time. But if you're picking the 108 best players in the world, obviously the top 10, top 20 even will probably be, players from the more established nations. But as you get, lower down, the best players from the less established nations are probably better than, some of the, more inexperienced and, lower, or I don't want to say lower quality, but, you know, less experienced players, less, maybe technically gifted players from established nations. That's something a lot of franchise tournaments miss, I think, is they're very willing to give opportunities to players just because they come from Australia, they come from England, they come from South Africa, when they would probably be better off with a player from Scotland, Ireland, Zimbabwe, Namibia, even Canada, US, UAE, these sorts of countries. The best players from those countries are probably better than some of the more middling players from full member nations, but that gets overlooked because they don't have the opportunities to play at the same level. and so we're gonna be crisscrossing with the men's game a lot in this discussion. But in the men's game, very few players from associate nations are established on the T20 circuits, and those that are really broke through because they were given a chance to play as a local player in some league, and it's only after they broke into the T20 league system they got to proliferate through the rest of them. Like Ali Khan got to play as a local player in the CPL. Paul Sterling got to play as a local player in the T20 Blast and the 100. Tim David got to play as a local player in the BBL. And, for a lot of players, that opportunity doesn't exist. And, it makes it a lot harder for them to break into that system. They're not going to get the same opportunities. And I think that's something Fairbreak is really, it's done really differently here, because you're not filling out the best 108 players in the world with, 15 players from Pakistan, 15 players from South Africa, 15 players from Sri Lanka. It's a few players from each country, and as you get through it, you see that you do get a lot of players who aren't from these established places, right? You've had just a player from Rwanda, a few from Nepal, Germany, Canada, the UAE, Kuwait, Philippines, Namibia, Argentina, Tanzania, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Thailand, Austria, Hong Kong, all these places, Bhutan, even Vanuatu, Sweden. This is probably the most global tournament cricket's ever seen. And, that is a very, it gives hope for the future of the game. If more tournaments, maybe not follow exactly like this, but, tournaments like this can show the world that, you don't have to keep looking in the same 12, probably not even 12, the same 6 nations for players. Expand your horizons a little and you will find quality players. And that's the
Yeah,
most important thing here.
I think I have already talked about it once, and it is a simple point that women's game is not exactly the same as the men's game. Obviously, there's a scope for it to develop much differently than the men's game did. As you talked about that, even a global tournament like IPL could not really push that mentality of giving chance to these relatively lesser known players from the lower ranked sides. I mean, it has been 15 years and we are still waiting for someone to sign Paul Sterling, who would have easily been one of the best openers if someone had bothered to sign him. And
Yeah,
it
it
kind
took it
of
took Mumbai going into full crisis mode for them to finally play Tim David.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of sad and confusing because these franchisees, some of these franchisees look like the teams that know their talent really well. I mean, if I'd not see it, I'd not believe it that Jasprit Bumrah, Kunal Pandya, and Hardik Pandya were combined bought for 4 million in 2013 and 14 auctions back then. So it is kind of a thing where we know that these franchisees can identify the talent, but I guess that just applies to the domestic setup rather than the away games. So that is something this fair break tournament is willing to break. That mindset around low ranked teams that maybe their players are not as good. I mean, I like to call this the John Davison dilemma because he was the first associate player that I ever watched do well. Although obviously he had a lot of his initial days in Australia, but still he played for Canada and he did really well in all the 3 editions of World Cup that he did. And maybe the same applies for these guys as well because if they are going to get these games here with all the high up teams and their players, and if they can share and extend that over to their own teams, then we might have a world of women's cricket where There are not just 6 teams or 8 teams. There are maybe 10 teams. There are maybe 15. So I think this tournament, this Fairbreak tournament, has something unique up its sleeve to serve the women's game, I guess.
And another thing the tournament did was they paid quite highly for a women's tournament, and that, again, that's another great opportunity. Not even just for the players who might have never been able to play for this sort of money before from the lower ranked teams, but even for some of the players from full member nations. This is a lot more than what they'd usually get from their own T20 tournament contracts, even national team contracts. And yeah, it just shows that the quality is there, and if you are able to pay your players better, you will get better players.
I think it is quite a simple thing, in my opinion, because if you look at it that way, you know, eh, someone like India does it in a kind of a different way. I mean, if you look at a game played by Indian team, you or even Pakistan, because there's Indians and Pakistanis everywhere in the world. So a game is being viewed in almost all the continents, maybe 6 if you don't count Antarctica, and there's people who in US, in Canada, in Sweden, in Netherlands, even in deep reaches of Africa, there's people who want to watch the game. So I think that is one good thing about this tournament, that why by bringing in representations from all over these countries, you are making the people from that country interested in the game. Because this is the age of social media and news travels fast. So you would expect the news to travel around the world regarding what different players from what different countries are playing this tournament, and if it travels well, then you can engage a huge crowd, because obviously, as we said, 35 countries, that's a lot of people. And if you can engage even a few of them from each one, then you got a huge audience, and you got a tournament that might as well be one of the biggest in the women's setup.
So the tournament wasn't exactly perfect. There were definitely a few things they can try to improve for next time. They've already announced that the next tournament is going to be, I think, in March 2023 in Hong Kong. One thing I didn't like was, okay, so they played it in Dubai. That's not a problem. What I didn't like is that they played every single match at the Dubai Cricket Stadium. I feel this way for a lot of tournaments. I don't like it when they play a lot of games in one place. I would much prefer them to spread the games around. Dubai doesn't. Dubai has multiple international stadiums. They could have played a few games at the ICC Academy, which I also think is just a better stadium than the Dubai Cricket Stadium. I don't like the Dubai Cricket Stadium. I've
I
been there
understand.
multiple times. I'm just not a fan. Uh, yeah, the ICC Academy ground is a rather chill place. It's very relaxed. Very, it has a nice view from it as well. I would have preferred a few games over there. And in Hong Kong, I don't think Hong Kong has like a major international stadium like the Dubai Cricket Stadium, so there probably is a little bit more scope to play games at a couple of more similar grounds, and I do hope that's something they do instead of sticking every match at the same ground. And even going forward, they will probably return to the UAE at some point. So next time they do, don't just stick it in one stadium. Play at the ICC Academy, play at Sharjah. Try playing in places like Ajman and Elaine. There are some other really nice grounds in the UAE that never get touched for international cricket, and I think they could try playing there because it's not that hard to get there in the UAE. It's a very well connected country. Dubai to Abu Dhabi is only an hour. Dubai to Ajman is just an hour. I want to see them with more variety of locations to play at. It's something I always like to see in tournaments, and I'm not a fan of pretty much cricket as a whole uh, trying to cut down on the number of places they play at instead of increasing.
I think, purely from a long-term perspective, I do not mind them playing in a single stadium because obviously, as the tournament progresses, as it gets more hype and more people knowing it, there would obviously be a time where they would be able to expand it further. As you said, it is going to be in Hong Kong next year, and maybe this is early on, and maybe they didn't want a lot of traveling to be included here. But I think I won't mind it as much right now, since it is obviously it's first year, maybe second or third year, they can obviously go places, and I won't even mind if they could take the tournament to a place like Netherlands, where there is a few rounds. I think there's Malahide, there's one in The Hague, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, Malhide's in Ireland, not
Oh,
Netherlands.
pardon. I think there's just one in Hague.
And
If I
there's one in the Hague. There's one in Amstelveen, which is close to Amsterdam.
Okay, I'm still being.
There's one in
Yeah. So
Rotterdam.
okay. Yeah. So that is my point. I mean, obviously the tournament can go places. It is one of those things where there's a fun above everything kind of situation where I think people wanted to experiment with the concept where there's a lot of players from different teams. They basically a huge IPL or WBBL kind of sorts, and looks like it has worked in some ways. And one thing we should not forget is there was not a lot of involvement from subcontinental players this year, and I'm expecting if there's more players from subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh involved in the tournament next time. Maybe I'm expecting the players that were rejected due to the senior women's T20 challenge. Maybe they'll travel for the tournament next year. Maybe the tournament will, you know, gather more pace, and maybe it will get much more famous in the next years if that happens. So you never know.
Yeah, and another thing that I had an issue with that I think will probably hold the tournament back quite a bit is the quality of the broadcasts, which I don't think was particularly impressive. Like some of the broadcasters had their own issues. There's one issue I think with the tournament in continental Europe where Free Sport had the rights to the tournament in continental Europe, but they don't broadcast to continental Europe, so people on the continent couldn't watch the tournament legally. And yeah, that was just like the tip of the iceberg. I understand that they're not able to bring in the best commentators for it, but the commentators they did have sometimes felt a little a little rushed in their preparations. And just in general, I think the quality of the broadcast could be something that could be improved quite a bit. And if it isn't, then there is going to be a bit of an upper limit on how deep the tournament can penetrate the general wider sporting landscape.
I mean, when it comes to something like broadcast quality or
Like
even the
obviously, like
commentators,
having it broadcast at all is better than it not being broadcast at all, like the women's T20 challenge was. But it could be a lot better, and I don't think it's acceptable to. I don't think it's good to accept mediocrity by saying at least it's there. You can do a lot better, and I think they should be aiming for a lot better.
I mean, one thing that we should remember that both, the broadcast quality or the commentators, these are the kind of things that will improve as the financial freedom of the tournament increases. Obviously, I think since this was more of a experimental edition of the tournament, maybe they didn't want to invest more in, let's say, broadcast quality or even the commentators, and maybe their focus was on paying the players well, so maybe they wanted to see the players coming back next year. So you can maybe hold down for a while. That once the tournament gets off the ground completely, you might see international commentators. The folks that we see in bigger games, bigger in more recognized games. I mean, I would love to see someone like Zainab Abbas or even Mel Jones. There's Lisa Stillacre. If there are these people that can be involved with the game in near future, then maybe they can get better. But obviously there's a financial aspect to this, and I think once the tournament gets off the ground financially, maybe we'll see these folks and maybe we'll see a better broadcast. Who knows, maybe we might end up seeing it on TV as well. Yes.
To think that about covers it for Fairbreak, then like as we said at the start, the results aren't that important. It's just the simple fact that the tournament is happening and what it stands for. That's a lot more. It's a lot more poignant at the moment than what happened in the tournament. But if you are curious, the Tornadoes won. The Tornadoes won the tournament. They beat the Falcons in the final. There's also a third place playoff where the Spirit beat the Barmy Army team. And, quite an extraordinary third place match where there were two centuries. Yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of a wonder that always there's a Chamari Atapattu, Sophie Devine, and Maizan Cup end up in the finals of a tournament.
Yeah. So what's coming up for the women's game? Some of the big picture stuff going forward. There's the Commonwealth Games in I think it's 10 weeks now. I think was what I saw. The Commonwealth Games starts in 10 weeks. So that'll be interesting to see, especially as we'll get to in a little bit. Australia, the favorites, have lost their coach.
Yeah, I mean, one thing with Australia at this moment that I kind of think is they are kind of their own monster right now. I mean, the team is in kind of a spot where they know what each player's role is and they know how to overcome a certain situation. I mean, WNCLS and WBBL have done really well to get the players accustomed to a certain kind of situation or a certain spot or a certain role. But one thing that we cannot underestimate is how the women's game is evolving right now. I mean, New Zealand and India are getting better. Obviously, not at the pace as Australia or England have. But in case there's not there's a coach that is not as good as someone like Matthew Mott or even Catherine Fitzpatrick, who was the coach before Matthew Mott took over, then we might see a decline, especially given that now all of their gun players are getting into their 30s. There's Perry, there's Haynes, there's Healy, even Lenning. So we might see kind of a more level playing field if that happens.
Yeah, it'll just be interesting to see how they handle this immediately after the shakeup in coaching, because they're not going to have much time to develop anything new ahead of the Commonwealth Games because it is coming up very quickly. And then after the Commonwealth Games, there was supposed to be the Asian Games, but that's been postponed, which is a little disappointing. China has their reasons for postponing it. I understand, but I do think it would have been very interesting to see, because India probably wasn't going to send a team, from what I understand, or if they did, they would have sent a second string side. Pakistan were also going to send a second string side, which I think would have left the door open for Thailand to grab a gold medal. But that's been postponed now, and we don't know till when, so that'll have to wait. Then after that, we have T20 World Cup next year, 2023.
Yeah, there's also under 19 World Cup.
Sorry?
The under 19 T20 World Cup.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be a busy 12 months in the women's game now. And then there's Fairbreak 2023 as well right after that.
Yeah, there's the 100 as well in August 2023 and WBBL as well. One thing that is really good with the women's game right now, maybe that might be my final words. There is a lot of mystique around women's game right now. I mean, how I don't know how to word this, but recently the men's game has kind of felt overexposed, to say the least. I mean, you have seen England; they play like 100 tests every year, and that is kind of starting to get on my nerves. India do not play a lot of ODIs, but the IPL is kind of starting to stretch way too long, and it is obviously starting to repel people because of its length. And there are other things that are not good for the game, because you can't really expect people to tune in every day to watch the game, even if it is their favorite players playing, because people always obviously have limited attention span, and that is kind of being exceeded right now. But as far as women's game goes, there's a lot of situations where people want to know things about the game right now. I mean, when I first watched the T20 challenge live in 2020, there was I was pretty curious to see all the talent that India has that was not on the show until then, and it was kind of nice to follow all that, even the international players that were involved. And I mean, even at this point, you see someone like Laura Bolvart or Lizzie Lee, who have been playing for a long time now, and you still want to see them play more because they are relatively underexposed. So there's the desire within people to know more about the game and see more of the women's game, which is exactly opposite of the men's game. So I think that is something going to be working in their favor as more tournaments arrive. So if they can exploit that well, I think a women's game has the chance to rule the roost in the future.
So the final thing I want to talk about real quick, as we touched upon earlier, Matthew Mott has gone from the Australian women's team to becoming the white ball coach of the England men's team. And yeah, that's a very interesting appointment because I can't think of many instances of in any sport really of a coach going from the top of the women's game to the top of the men's game in one step. Like I can remember John Herdman, the Canadian coach. He was the coach of the Canadian women's team, then went to the Canadian men's team. But the Canadian men's team was hardly elite when he made the switch to from women's to men. Uh, the Canadian football teams. I'm talking about not the cricket teams. But yeah, Matthew Mott going from the best team in women's cricket to the best white ball team, arguably, in men's cricket. It's definitely a very interesting appointment. Yeah, one comment I saw that I thought was very interesting was, Mott has experience with turning the marginally best team in the world into the definitively best team in the world, which is something England are looking for with their white ball team. And that's experience which is very hard to come by. So yeah, it's definitely a very, very canny appointment by England, and it will be interesting to see how that goes. As we mentioned earlier, with the Australian women's team, where they go from here, yeah, they are do mostly seem like a team that could coach themselves, especially with all the experienced hands in the dressing room. But at the same time, Mott did change the mentality of that team. Several players in the women's team have talked about how Mott changed the way they approach the game. And, changed the mindset from just winning to dominating, and that is what the Australian team has done. I think Mott has coached in 17 ODI series since he took over in 2015, and Australia won all of them. He's only lost like 6 ODIs out of over 50, and most of them were in his first few months in charge. One of them was the 2017 semifinal. And yeah, like Mott has just been, he's Australia was the best team in the world when he took over in 2015, and he's turned them into this unstoppable behemoth. And if he can do the same with the England white ball team, it's definitely a very scary prospect.
Is obviously the England men's team is in the white ball is a little bit different than the Aussie women team setup, especially because there are still a few places, especially the subcontinent, where England team still struggles to an extent. I mean, they have not won an ODI series in India for what 36 years now, if I am correct. And we should know that since the reign of Morgan started, they have played two ODI series and two T20 series in India, and they have not won either of them. So that is one of the examples of a few things there's here and there that remains to be achieved. Maybe the T20 World Cup. I mean, they have been doing well in T20 games ever since uh, the reign of Morgan started, but still they kind of went down in the T20 World Cup this year. So that is another thing that they might want to take off, especially given that now Morgan and some other guys are in their 30s and might not be playing for that long. I mean, Morgan himself is 36, Malan is 35. So, you know, obviously there's also a big responsibility on the coach's head to transfer this mentality from these experienced blokes to the newer generation of the team, especially you have someone like Liam Livingston, who is relatively fresh and embodies the same dominating mindset. So I think it would be a good chance for obviously Matthew Mott and the experienced bunch from England to make the transfer of knowledge to the young bunch and maybe accomplish the few things that have been still on the pending.
Yeah, I just want to say I think the comparison between England and Australia is a lot closer than you're giving it credit for, because I do think Australia were not undisputed best team in the world when Mott took over in 2015, because they had lost the last two Ashes. They had lost five of the last six Ashes series. They didn't win. So they did win the 2013, 2014 World Cups, but they weren't as dominant as their 2022 win was, and they would go on to lose the World Cups in 2016 and 2017. So I would agree that Australia were the best team in the world in 2015, but not the undisputed best team in the world. They're only marginally better than their competition. But under Mott, that transformed into being way ahead of everyone else. And I do think that is similar to the situation England find themselves in right now. In the men's white ball game, it's very different story in the test arena. But so yeah, as I've said with Mott, if he can have that same sort of transformative effect as on the England men's team as he's had on the Australian women's team, it will be a very scary prospect. But it does remain to be seen how well he can translate that to a completely different environment. As what we were saying about the Australian women's team, they're a side that can coach themselves, really. I've heard that a lot about the England men's team as well, but this self-taught side, side that can coach itself, it has struggled at times. It hasn't won a T20 World Cup. It's fallen short the last two times. It didn't dominate the last ODI World Cup as they expected to sort of squeak their way to the final and win it narrowly. They are the best team in the world, in my opinion, but they're not the undisputed best team in the world. And, it will be interesting to see if that can change under Mott.
Yeah, I mean that would be one thing to be seen because it looks like England team does better in the shorter spans. I mean, if you see them playing in a T20 series or in an ODI series, the level of dominance would probably be higher as compared to something like a multinational tournament of sorts. Even you can say it about the ODI World Cup, because most of the games that they dominated were not really against the higher ranked sides. Even the game against they lost against Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So there were those two games. Indian game was somewhat close, but ultimately they won it rather comfortably. So you can say that they are the kind of team that does well in the in bilaterals. Might need to do relatively better in the multinational tournaments. But again, that is a very small sample size for us to see, because obviously both the games that they lost, the semi-final in 2016 and the semi-final in 2021, were kind of based on a freak innings rather than England being outplayed. So it rather remains to be seen how they do. Once Matthew Mott comes up, maybe there'll be a different mindset around those kinds of games, especially that we now that we know that even in the 2019 World Cup final there was a lot of you know chopping and changing. The game kept going this way and that way till the end, obviously. So we are kind of seeing them being a bit of bit nervous in those knockout games. So maybe Matthew Mott can change that.
I think that about covers it for today then. So it's been nice having you on. I'll see you next time.
Thank you. I'll see you next time.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.